There's been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died. The Soviets may have been fairly quick to acknowledge the accident because evidence in the form of mild nuclear radiation had already reached beyond the Soviet borders to Scandinavia. We begin with ABC's Dean Reynolds.
At 1:23 in the morning, on Saturday, the 26th of April, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. The blast tore through the building, blew open the reactor hall, and threw radioactive material into the night sky. But inside the control room, the men on duty did not immediately understand what had happened. Some thought a steam tank had burst. Others believed the reactor was still intact. The idea that the core itself had been destroyed was almost unthinkable. Outside, pieces of graphite from inside the reactor lay scattered across the ground and roof. They looked like broken black blocks. In reality, they were so radioactive that standing near them could be deadly. The disaster had begun. But to understand how Chernobyl reached that point, we have to go back to the previous morning. At 1:06 a.m. on April 25th, reactor number 4 began a planned shutdown for maintenance. Before the reactor was taken offline, staff were meant to carry out a test. It was supposed to check whether the plant could keep its cooling pumps running for a short time if outside electrical power was lost. This mattered because nuclear reactors still need cooling even after shutdown. The chain reaction can be stopped, but the fuel remains extremely hot. If the pumps lose power, that heat can become dangerous very quickly. The test had been tried before, but the results had not been good enough. So on this day, the operators were going to try again. At first, everything appeared routine. By the early morning, the reactor's power had been reduced. The plan was to lower output gradually, run the test, then complete the shutdown. But Chernobyl was not operating in isolation. It was feeding electricity into the Soviet power grid, and later that day, the grid controller asked for reactor 4 to remain online longer than planned, so the test was delayed. That delay changed the whole situation. The day shift, who had prepared for the test, would not be the ones to carry it out. The evening shift also came and went. By the time the test finally moved forward, it had passed to the night shift, a crew working through the early hours with a reactor already in an unusual condition. At around 2 p.m. on April 25th, one important safety system had already been disabled as part of the test preparations, the emergency core cooling system. This did not cause the explosion by itself. It was not the single fatal mistake, but it meant one more layer of protection was no longer available. For hours, reactor 4 stayed at about half power, waiting for permission to continue the shutdown. Then, at 11:10 p.m., the grid controller finally allowed the power reduction to continue. The operators began lowering the reactor again. Shortly after midnight, the night shift took over. At 12:05 a.m., the reactor had dropped to around 720 megawatts thermal. That was lower than normal operating power, but still manageable. Then came a crucial moment. At 12:28 a.m., power suddenly fell far too low. Instead of stabilizing at the intended level, the reactor dropped to around 30 megawatts thermal. That was a serious problem. At such low power, the reactor became harder to control because of a buildup of xenon-135, a substance that absorbs neutrons and suppresses the nuclear reaction. The operators now faced a choice. They could stop and abandon the test, or try to bring the reactor back up. They chose to continue. To raise the power, they withdrew control rods from the core. Control rods are meant to manage the reaction. Insert them, and the reaction slows down. Pull them out, and the reaction increases. But by removing more rods, the crew reduced the reactor's safety margin. At about 1 a.m., they managed to bring the power back up to roughly 200 megawatts thermal. That was still much lower than originally planned. Even so, the test went ahead. This is where Chernobyl becomes frightening, because from the control room, the situation did not look like a catastrophe. The reactor was unstable, but it had not failed yet. The operators were trying to keep it balanced. The instruments were giving them numbers. The procedure was still moving. But inside the core, conditions were becoming more dangerous. At 1:03 a.m., another cooling pump was switched on. At 1:07, one more was added. The extra water flow changed the reactor's behavior again. More water passing through the core affected steam levels, and in an RBMK reactor like Chernobyl's, steam and reactivity were dangerously connected. The design had what is known as a positive void coefficient. Put simply, under certain conditions, more steam can make the reactor more reactive, not less. That design feature was one of the reasons reactor 4 became so unstable. By 1:19 a.m., the operators were still trying to keep the reactor within workable limits. They increased feed water flow to deal with low water levels in the steam drums. Pressure changed. Automatic systems responded. Manual adjustments followed. It was a constant struggle to keep the reactor steady, and each adjustment left less room for error. At 1:22:30 a.m., just before the test began, later calculations showed that the operating reactivity margin had fallen below the allowed minimum. In simpler terms, too many control rods had been withdrawn. The reactor should not have been in that condition, but the test continued. At 1:23:04 a.m., the turbine steam valves were closed. This was the beginning of the actual test. The turbine started to slow down. The idea was to see whether its remaining momentum could keep generating enough electricity to power the pumps for a short period. For a few seconds, nothing looked obviously disastrous. Then the reactor began to surge. At 1:23:40 a.m., someone pressed the emergency shutdown button, known as AZU-5. That button was supposed to insert the control rods and stop the reaction. But the RBMK control rods had a dangerous flaw. Their tips were made of graphite. When they first entered the core, they could briefly increase reactivity before reducing it. For a few seconds, nothing looked obviously disastrous. Then the reactor began to surge. The reactor was now out of control. At around 1:23:46 a.m., the first explosion ripped through Reactor 4. A second explosion followed moments later. The force destroyed the reactor core and blew apart the upper structure of the building. The massive biological shield above the reactor was lifted. The roof was torn open. Radioactive fuel and graphite were exposed to the air. The night above Chernobyl began to glow. In the control room, confusion took over. The operators were dealing with alarms, broken instruments, and impossible readings. Some were sent to inspect the damage. What they found did not make sense at first. The reactor hull was gone. Fires had broken out. Pipes were ruptured. Debris was everywhere. One of the most dangerous misunderstandings in those first minutes was the belief that the reactor might still be intact. Because if the reactor was still intact, then the priority was to pump water into it. Workers tried to do exactly that. But there was no intact core to cool. Outside, firefighters arrived from the nearby plant fire brigade. They were not told they were entering one of the most radioactive places on Earth. To them, it looked like a fire at an industrial site. They climbed onto roofs covered with radioactive debris. They handled hoses. They stood near graphite from the reactor core. Some tasted metal in their mouths. Some felt their skin burn. At the time, many still did not understand why. Their job was to stop the fires spreading to Reactor 3, which was still dangerously close to the destroyed unit. If those fires had spread further, the disaster could have become even worse. By around 5 a.m., the main fires on the roof had been brought under control, but the reactor itself was still open. Radiation was pouring into the air. 2 plant workers died on the night of the explosion or shortly afterwards from immediate injuries. Many firefighters and workers who responded in the first hours received massive doses of radiation. In the following weeks, dozens would die from acute radiation sickness. A few kilometers away, the city of Pripyat was waking up. Pripyat had been built for the workers of Chernobyl. It was a young city with families, schools, apartment blocks, shops, and playgrounds. On the morning of April the 26th, many residents still had no clear warning. People went outside. Children played. Some residents had watched the strange glow from the direction of the power plant during the night. They did not know radioactive material had been carried over the city. The evacuation did not begin that morning. It did not begin at noon. It began the next day, April the 27th, roughly 36 hours after the explosion. Buses arrived in Pripyat, and residents were told to take only essential belongings. Many believed they would return within a few days. Most never lived there again. In the days that followed, the Soviet authorities struggled to contain both the reactor and the truth. Helicopters flew over the destroyed unit, dropping materials such as sand, clay, lead, and boron in an attempt to smother the fire and reduce radiation release. Thousands of workers were eventually sent into the exclusion zone. They became known as liquidators. They cleared radioactive debris, built containment structures, and carried out dangerous work in conditions few people had ever faced. The first emergency shelter, often called the sarcophagus, was built over the destroyed reactor later in 1986. It was a desperate engineering project, completed under extreme radiation levels. Years later, a much larger structure, the new safe confinement, was built and moved over the old shelter to contain what remains of Reactor 4. The human impact was immense. According to UNSIR, 134 workers and emergency responders suffered acute radiation sickness. 28 of them died within the first few months. Later, thousands of thyroid cancer cases were recorded among people who had been children or adolescents at the time and were exposed to radioactive iodine. The wider consequences were political, environmental, and psychological. Chernobyl damaged trust in the Soviet system. It showed how dangerous secrecy could be during a disaster. It forced the nuclear industry to confront design flaws, training failures, and weak safety culture. But the most haunting part of Chernobyl is still the timeline. There was no single moment where everything suddenly became inevitable. The reactor was pushed closer to the edge over hours. A delayed test, a sudden power drop, a decision to continue, control rods withdrawn too far, extra pumps switched on, an unstable reactor design, an emergency shutdown that came too late, and when it came, made the surge worse. At 1:23 a.m., Reactor 4 exploded. But the disaster had been building long before anyone in the control room pressed the final button.